It is great to have back on the show today Congressman Jake Auchincloss, representing Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District. It's great to have you back on. There's so much to talk about. I want to first maybe take your temperature on the shutdown and then go into some related issues. You, if I understand your position correctly, you've said Democrats shouldn't just cave and reopen the government, and that some of the structural reforms, the healthcare subsidies, some of these other things are important. How do you balance that with the fact that the shutdown also has negative impacts on people? And how do you decide where you land ultimately?
I don't want a shutdown. Shutdowns are bad for the American people. They undermine the integrity of the federal government. And I don't think it's Democrats who are shutting down the government. Republicans have the White House, the Senate, the House. They've claimed a mandate. They've also declared that they, quote, hate Democrats. And now they have found themselves with their vaunted mandate unable to keep the government open precisely because they won't talk to Democrats. This is Congress 101. You want a deal, you negotiate. But Donald Trump has spent more time and more willingness to negotiate with Hamas than he has with the Democratic Party. That is a failure of his governance. Before this shutdown, I put forward a series of proposals that would be a starting point to get to yes. Talked about reversing the worst of the Medicaid cuts, particularly through Medicaid 1115 waivers, which I'm happy to talk more about. Talking about funding COPS grants so that local law enforcement have the tools they need to hire and train police officers. Talked about a vote on the tariffs that have been the biggest tax hike in the history of the middle class. Basic things, all of which have a supermajority of support from Americans, none of which are esoteric partisan issues, right? And they haven't so much as picked up the phone.
Do you think shutdowns are ever appropriate to use as leverage? Or would you rather see shutdowns done away with altogether? I mean, not every government, in some places, if the government gets to the point where it's going to shut down, there's an automatic call for elections, for example, and there are very real repercussions for the lawmakers that allow that to happen. I mean, what's your sense if we zoom out, understanding that you never want a shutdown?
Love the question, and in fact, I just wrote a Substack on this question on my Substack, Simple But Not Easy, where I call for multi-year agency-specific appropriations. So, David, if you'd be willing to let me wonk out for 1 minute here,
please,
for our listeners. The way it works now is there are, every year, on September 30th, funding runs out. And every single year, Congress basically has to agree on every single element of the federal government, its budget. And that's been the way basically for the last 40 years, 50 years, roughly, since about the 1970s is the way we've done it. Since it started in the 1970s, only 4 times has Congress successfully funded the entire federal government on time. 4 times. It's like 10% or fewer of the years, and never in the 21st century. So this system is broken. The single year appropriations of across the board funding for the federal government is broken. My approach is simple and I think more tightly scoped, which is to say Congress should take its time on an agency by agency basis to do multi-year authorizations and appropriations. So for example, the Federal Aviation Administration, those are air traffic controllers and airport inspections. We come together, the authorizing committee, which would be transportation infrastructure. They agree on new policy for the FAA, which by the way, we did 2 years ago. It was a good bipartisan process. Then based on that new authorization, you give them 5 years worth of funding. And basically a ticket that says every year they go back to the Treasury and they draw funding based on that 5-year authorization. For maybe the Environmental Protection Agency, we do it for 10 years. Maybe for the National Institutes of Health, which we want to really insulate from politics, we do it for 15 years. Maybe for the Department of Defense, based on the Constitution's prohibition on a standing army, we do it every single year to keep it as close as possible to the will of the people. But you stagger different agencies for different time lengths based on insulation from politics versus accountability to the public will. And Congress is able to take its time on both the authorization, which is the policy, and the appropriations, which is the money. And that way we're not every single September in this situation where we've had 9 months of posturing followed by 6 hours of behind the scenes deal making that doesn't produce a great product because it was thrown together at the last minute.
That makes a lot of sense, and my instinct is that my audience is going to respond quite favorably to that. Sort of ancillary or tangential to the shutdown is the issue surrounding the election of your forthcoming colleague, Adelita Grijalva. Now, we're going to be talking to her tomorrow on the show. I'm curious, is there anything you can tell us that's happening behind the scenes with your colleagues? And you don't have to name anybody, but just generally, where there's an acknowledgement that a lot of the attempt to delay her swearing in is related to her expected vote on the Epstein files, which would be to release rather than to cover up. Is that really a salient matter to your Republican colleagues as far as you know? Is that at play here and why they're playing these games?
Yes. I want to put forward 2 points on the Epstein issue. One is the biggest scandal to me is not what might be in those Epstein files, right? The biggest scandal to me is that even if the worst of the worst that we are imagining were to come out in the Epstein files, let's imagine, which is not a long stretch to imagine, that Donald Trump was just smeared across the Epstein files in a series of very, very compromising positions. The biggest scandal is that even if that were to become common knowledge, the Republican Party would still cover for him. A bunch of Republican members of the Congress would walk down the hallways and mumble when reporters asked them questions, and they would say, "Oh, I didn't see that," or "Well, I guess that's not really an issue that the American people," blah, 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 blah. This guy could literally be a fully compromised pedophile, and the Republican Party would still back him. That tells us all we need to know about how broken the Republican Party is behind Donald Trump and how broken this cult of personality has become for the American public. The other issue about the Epstein files is that it's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the endemic corruption in this administration, where there's one set of rules for the tech moguls, there's one set of rules for RFK Jr. and his henchmen, there's one set of rules for Howard Lutnick and his crypto bros, and there's another set of rules for the middle class, where they just can't get ahead under Trump's administration.
Now, if ultimately, I mean, even Marjorie Taylor Greene said the other day, ultimately, Grijalva is going to be sworn in. Ultimately, they're going to get the vote. What is the play then in order to try to delay if eventually it's going to come out?
I don't know Speaker Johnson's machinations. My hunch is that it actually won't be Speaker Johnson who ends up running obstruction at the last moment for Donald Trump. It'll actually be Pam Bondi. As we saw with her recent testimony to Congress, she has fully vacated even the illusion of a Department of Justice that has a firewall with the White House and that is pursuing justice impartially. It's a fully owned entity of Trump Incorporated. And my hunch is she'll find some semi-legal or illegal way of just ignoring the congressional dictum. And I think what's imperative for Democrats is to not make this an isolated situation around the Epstein files. I know those have the most salience. I know those are the most salacious.
Yep.
But to describe and to delineate how this is just one dot of a constellation of corruption. I mean, you've got the Secretary of Commerce flacking his own crypto enterprise in Pakistan and the Middle East. You've got RFK Jr.'s top policy aides owning companies on the side that are flacking bidets with tax preference dollars. You've got Brad Smith, who ran CMS for the first 100 days, hooking up health insurance corporations with less regulation and more reimbursement, despite the fact that those health insurance corporations are investors in his company that he's currently running. And don't even get me started on the Trump family itself, right? Like the Trump coin and his sons. This is threaded through, this is marbled within the patrimony of Donald Trump. And the Epstein files are one example of it.
I want to zoom out a little, and this is the last sort of general area I want to talk about. If we just look historically, Republicans having taken the White House in 2024, the 26 midterms should be pretty good for your party. At the same time, we have, number one, some polling concerns as to the status of the Democratic Party right now. Number two, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing this case that could impact potentially as many as 19 currently blue seats, which could turn red depending on how that shakes out. Governor Newsom, who we recently had on and we'll be talking to again, has Prop 50 going in California to try to mitigate some of this. The point here is a midterm that really should be pretty good for your party may not be so. And one of the things I keep hearing from my audience is you know, David, I know that Republicans are offering me a proverbial rotten meal, but then I hear from Democrats, and even if they've got a nice meal, they're certainly not explaining why it's better in ways that are emotionally salient. And we saw this in the exit polls of 24, which was a lot of voters weren't really convinced that what was better for the average middle class voter was Kamala Harris rather than Donald Trump. Are you and your colleagues behind the scenes sort of acknowledging, hey, our messaging is not necessarily getting through. We have a problem here. What do we do? Like, I think my voters want to hear about, like, if the platform is that much better, why is something in the communication not functioning well?
Yeah. It shouldn't be behind the scenes. It needs to be fully out in the open. And it's not a messaging problem, it's an ideas problem. I am fed up with Beltway strategists and consultants who sort of massage and message test and pressurize different talking points. No, like it's about, you know, framing it as the working class, blah, blah, blah. And it's really condescending to the average American. The average American is listening or reading 4 to 6 hours of content online every single day, video, audio, text. They have the appetite to hear Democrats explain ideas in depth, new ideas that challenge the status quo and that explain why we are the party of improvement and we are the party for the middle class. The middle class has not had a voice in the Trump administration. The middle class doesn't have a super PAC, it doesn't have a lobby, but it should have the Democratic Party. Alyssa Slotkin has been clear on this matter, and I subscribe to her point of view. And now we need to explain to the middle class why we are going to tackle and treat cost disease, which has afflicted housing and healthcare and utilities, which now consume more than half of a middle class family's take-home pay. We will treat cost disease to make life more affordable. We will take on corruption on both sides. I've talked about the corruption of MAGA, but there is corruption on both sides. And we need to take it on through election reform that gets rid of partisan primaries and gerrymandering and Citizens United. And we need to become the party trusted on education. The school closures were a catastrophe. We have not put forward a resonant and refreshing education agenda in the last 5 years. And we need to talk about building 1,000 trade schools, about surging one-on-one high-dosage tutoring to every student in America, and about banning smartphones across the classrooms of this country so that these kids can learn and thrive.
So in your mind, the communication maybe could use some improvement, but it's also a core of ideas that really will make people's lives better. Are you saying that those ideas have been missing, or that they haven't been conceived in a way that's salient to people?
Haven't been conceived. There was an old maxim that Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line. That's not true anymore. What happened over the last decade is that Republicans fell in love. They created a cult of personality around this individual, and Democrats fell in line. And they fell in line for some righteous reasons. And I think it actually is important to have discipline in the ranks in the House Democratic Caucus and the Senate Democratic Caucus, because we're in the minority and we have to hold the line. I don't have a problem with discipline. I do have a problem with an ideological straitjacket, because that ideological straitjacket is asphyxiating new ideas and young talent, and it's going to lock us into a permanent minority as a party. Even putting aside the rigging and the gerrymandering that Republicans are contesting, if we stay in this present course after the census in 2030, we will be locked out of a governing majority as a party. We have to realign the electorate. We have to define a new center based on the best ideas across different ideological factions in this country and be unapologetic about it. That means specific ideas that actually explain to the American people not just who we are against, but what we are for.
All right, Congressman Jake Auchincloss, I hope that more of your colleagues are thinking along these same lines, and I know that some are, and we've spoken to many of them. Always appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you again.
Good to be with you, David.